The goods, hmm, the goods and the services tax, commonly known as GST, is we should say is a broad-based VAT which has been developed in India over a period of time by merging almost all kind of various indirect taxes that were prevalent before 2017. So for example, when there was a manufacturing, we had to pay excise. So what was happening in excise that manufacturer who produces the goods was liable to pay excise duty to the government, but the net impact of such tax of excise paid to the government by the manufacturer falls on the person who is using the goods. So what is the basic crux of all indirect taxes? That the consumer has to pay to the government, but the relationship between the consumer and government is not direct. It is through that third person who is entitled to collect the indirect taxes by whatever name on behalf of the government from the consumer. So basically, government should know that who is collecting tax on my behalf, and also if I am the consumer, that I must know that the person to whom I am paying the tax, whether he is entitled to collect the tax or not. So whether it was the earlier times of different indirect taxes or whether they are the current times where most of the indirect taxes except customs have been clubbed into the GST, there is this concept of registration which basically denotes and serves both the purposes as I said. That is, by the process of registration, the government will have all the data of the person and that will entitle him to collect the tax on behalf of the government. So, in a way, it is the entitlement of a person to collect the tax on behalf of the government, serving two purposes that the government comes to know that who is collecting tax on my behalf, so government can keep control over such persons through the concept of return and assessment. And also, when this registration is done, then government allots a specific unique number, which in the case of the GST is what you call the GSTN, Goods and Service Registration Number. And this GST identification number, the GSTN denoted the network because all the formalities of the GST assessment, etc., are online. So we have the GST network, and that is why we have this GSTI, and that is GST identification number, which is a unique identity for every person who is agreeing to collect tax on behalf of the government based on various criterions and the eligibilities. And similarly, this GST number basically acts as a board or token of entitlement that the person, that is the consumer who is paying such taxes, comes to know that only the person with a valid GST can collect the tax. So, therefore, it has been required the only after you acquire your registration, you have your GST number, then you will have to display a GST number on all your places of business prominently so that every consumer who is buying for the goods or who is collecting the goods from such dealers, suppliers known as the word in GST, are able to see this entitlement through this GST. And also, whenever there is an invoice which has been raised for such value of the goods, because until you raise the invoice, you're not entitled to collect any GST, and that invoice will also collect or will also, sorry, denote this GST. So, all invoices and all places of business of such GST collectors has to prominently display this GST number so that the consumer know to whom he is paying the taxes. So, if we understand the prime importance of the GST registration, then you will realize that how and crucial is the registration for GST management. Now, moving further, we also have to realize that we also have to realize that this registration can either be compelled for you, compulsion for you to be there. What I'm saying that you fulfill certain eligibility, and once these eligibilities are fulfilled, then you will be required to take the registration. And sometimes you may not have fulfilled the requirements as of now, but still you believe that you should be a registered dealer, either because your business needs for it, or you believe that the eligibilities will be fulfilled over a period of time, then why wait for the time to come and why not take the registration now? So if you are fulfilling those eligibilities and therefore you are required to take such registration, and that is why we come with the word compulsory registration. And if you are not fulfilling those requirements, those eligibility conditions, but still you're opting for registration, then we say the word voluntary registration. As per the character, whether it's a voluntary registration or a compulsory registration, it does not make a difference because both will give you this unique GST and both will entitle you to collect the taxes. So this is the entitlement of collecting GST. And once you are entitled, then nobody can deny. That is, whenever the consumer is buying goods from such persons, then they have to pay. There is a compulsion to pay GST. So compulsion of paying GST. It is not voluntary that you may or you may not charge the GST. Once you become a GST registered dealer, then you will have to charge GST on all the supplies that have been made by you. Just for a moment. So once we realize the concept and the importance of registration and the types of the registration, now we should move forward with the eligibilities that requires a dealer to get registration. And that is why we use the word compulsory registration. So before we move into that, we have discussed in our earlier sessions on GST also that because GST is a VAT-based concept where the supply of the goods as well as the services is to be taxed. So here for the goods we use the word earlier the dealer, and for the services we use the word in the earlier regime as a supplier. But in the GST we have combined the word that the supply is the term which binds the two people. That is one person who is supplying the goods and the other person who is receiving the goods. So supplier gives supply to the recipient and in return gets the value, and this value is chargeable to the GST rate, and then you have the GST which can either be of the character CGST or SGST or IGST. And when we use the word SGST, we presume that it could be the state GST or the union territory GST. So whatever the nature of the GST is, this GST is paid to the respective governments. Because if it's a IGST or CGST or the UTGST, it goes to the central government, and if it's a SGST, then it goes to the respective state government. But keeping those things aside, if we move on to our concept, then you will find here that once the GST is to be paid to the government, so what is happening here that the supplier is collecting the tax from the recipient and paying to the government. So when the supplier collects the GST and this is to be collected from the recipient and then pays to the government, then it is the normal procedure of the GST, and we use the word forward charge mechanism. What is the word forward charge mechanism? but sometimes it happens in a reverse way. For example, when you are importing the goods, so sometimes what happens that the recipient, not the supplier, but instead the recipient of the services, recipient collects the GST from the supplier or from his own pocket, that doesn't make a difference to us, and pays to the government. Normally, it is not collected from the supplier normally, it is paid from the own pocket. But what the crux is that not the supplier is paying the tax to the government, but the recipient is paying tax to the government, and that is a special case or a case specific scenario, and that what you call the reverse charge mechanism. That is what you call the reverse charge mechanism. So ideally, when we will discuss these concepts in detail, then the nitty-gritty will be discussed there. But we needed to know this broad concept while discussing the concept of registration. So the primary focus of getting the company registration is based on a threshold limit, and this threshold limit is ideally 20 lakhs, and in some special states it is 10 lakhs. And this limit of 20 lakhs is also increased to 40 lakhs after 2019 for certain special cases. But what the point is that if the aggregate turnover, so before we discuss aggregate turnover, we should first understand the concept of the threshold limit, and then we will come to this word aggregate turnover. So the logic by default says that if if so the concept by default is that if there is a dealer commonly known as the supplier, and he is making the supply in common sense, अगर एक गुड्स का डीलर है तो वो माल बेच रहा है, सेल कर रहा है, और अगर एक वेल सर्विस का प्रोवाइडर है तो वो वैल्यू ऑफ द सर्विसेज जो है वो उसकी एग्रीगेट टर्नओवर काउंट करी गई, और उस एग्रीगेट टर्नओवर की जो अमाउंट है वो थ्रेशोल्ड लिमिट नॉर्मली जो 20 लाख है, अगर उसको एक्सीड कर देती है, then we believe then he is bound to get registration as per the GST laws, and thereafter he will be charging or collecting the GST from the recipient as per the forward charge mechanism. So the concept that comes here is that if you are a small dealer, then you are not under any obligation to get the registration until unless you are doing it voluntarily. And the logic for this is that the buyers of such small dealers will also be buying either in small quantity, or we believe that they are not financially so well. So just to reduce or just not to increase the burden of taxation on such buyers, and such small dealers will also not be in a way uh, possible for them, viable for them to get into the formalities and nitty-gritty of the GST. So they both have been exempted for. So कम माल बेचने वाला और कम दुकान छोटे दुकानदार से इस तरह का माल खरीदने वाला, वो दोनों फाइनेंशियली साउंड या फाइनेंशियली वो स्टेट के बायर सप्लायर हैं, जहां पर हमसे ये कहा गया या ये आपको बेनिफिट दिया गया जीएसटी के अंदर कि आपके ऊपर जीएसटी का बर्डन हटा दिया गया, क्योंकि आप जीएसटी रजिस्ट्रेशन कंपलसरी नहीं है, और अगर कंपलसरी नहीं है तो आपके ऊपर जीएसटी का बर्डन हट गया। तो इफ आई से कि अगर मैं दीपक गुप्ता पढ़ा रहा हूँ और मेरी वैल्यू ऑफ द सर्विसेज इन माय पर्सनल कैपेसिटी इज नॉट मोर देन 20 lakhs, तो मैं जीएसटी रजिस्ट्रेशन नहीं कराऊंगा, तो मैं अपने स्टूडेंट से भी उसकी फीस के ऊपर जीएसटी चार्ज नहीं करूंगा। लेकिन अगर मैं एक बड़ा एक कॉर्पोरेट कैरेक्टर का कोचिंग सेंटर हूँ जहां पर बड़ी बड़ी रेवेन्यू जनरेट हो रही है करोड़ में, तो मेरा जो कस्टमर है, जो स्टूडेंट है, अगर वो ज्यादा फीस दे के राजी है, तो देन ही इज आल्सो इन अ कैपेसिटी टू पे द जीएसटी। तो अगर आपने मेडिकल की कोचिंग के लिए या इंजीनियरिंग की कोचिंग के लिए या कॉमर्स की कोचिंग के लिए किसी बड़े, तो नॉर्मली जो लोग मेडिकल इंजीनियरिंग की कोचिंग करते हैं वहाँ टर्नओवर्स करोड्स में कैरी ऑन हो रही है। तो अगर मान लो आपने फिट जे के पास, वीएमसी के पास, आकाश के पास, बायजू के पास, इन तरह के किसी बड़े सेंटर्स के पास आपने रजिस्ट्रेशन लिया, सो उनकी क्योंकि टर्नओवर 20 लाख से ऊपर हो चुकी है, so they have already been registered because they have crossed the threshold limit, and therefore if you're joining as a student, you just don't have to pay the fees but also the GST on your total fees paid, and that increases the burden of yours, and the government believes that if you're ready to pay so much fees, then you're also in a capacity to pay the GST. It's not acceptable कि आप ज्यादा फीस पे करें बट आप जीएसटी पे ना करें. सेम गोज विद द रेस्टोरेंट्स, कि अगर आप किसी एक छोटे रेस्टोरेंट पे खाना खा रहे हैं जिसे आप कॉमर्स में ढाबा बोलते हैं, तो वहाँ गरीब आदमी खाना खा रहा है, वो वहां पर ज्यादा खर्च नहीं कर पा रहा, उस पर जीएसटी का बर्डन नहीं है. लेकिन अगर आप किसी एक एयर कंडीशन रेस्टोरेंट पे जा रहे हैं, तो अगर आप 200 रुपए की दाल खा सकते हैं, तो 200 रुपए की दाल के ऊपर कुछ जीएसटी भी पे कर सकते हैं. And that's why we say that the small dealers have been exempted, and hence their customers are also not under any burden to pay for any GST, and that is what the basic logic of threshold limit is all about. Further, when we talk of this limit 10 lakhs, then it is specific to certain states which are small in size, and therefore this turnover of 20 lakhs is too big for them. सो हम या ये समझते हैं कि जहां पर ये छोटे स्टेट्स में 20 लाख की जो टर्नओवर अचीव कर पा रहा है, वो वैसे ही बड़ा डीलर हो गया. तो छोटे स्टेट्स में छोटी टर्नओवर है, तो इसलिए थ्रेशोल्ड कम कर दी गई. तो जो जेन्युइनली छोटे डीलर्स हैं वही बेनिफिट उठा पाएंगे, और एक छोटे स्टेट में जिसकी टर्नओवर 10 लाख से ऊपर हो गई, then he will become a big dealer for that particular state, and that is why the four states of the northeast, that is namely the Manipur, the Meghalaya, the Nagaland, and the Mizoram. Earlier, this list was long, and there are around uh, 8 or 9 states which were covered in this beneficial scheme of 10 lakhs. But now, only these four states enjoy the benefit where, or I can say, they have a different threshold limit where the dealers having turnover up to 10 lakhs are not required to get registered. And if the turnover increases that figure, then they will be bound to get themselves registered. So, and for all other states, the figure has been kept as 20 lakhs until there is a special case of 40 lakh that will be discussed in the sessions to come, hopefully. So, if your aggregate turnover, so before I summarize this concept, we are also under obligation to understand the meaning of the word aggregate turnover. So, turnover by default denotes ऑल काइंड ऑफ सेल्स. तो अगर गुड्स का डीलर है तो जितना माल बेचता है वो, अगर सर्विसेज प्रोवाइडर है तो किस तरह की टोटल वैल्यू ऑफ द सर्विसेज है. बट द पॉइंट इज दैट नॉट ऑल काइंड ऑफ द गुड्स और द सर्विसेज आर अंडर द परव्यू ऑफ द जीएसटी. So there are two ways of expressing it, that GST is an improvement over VAT, and VAT was basically a state matter. So what was happening, that primarily the VAT and the excise were merged together to come into the concept of the GST. And when we use this word VAT, then the VAT was applicable on the sale, and the sale could have been either intrastate, यानी कि एक स्टेट के अंदर अंदर की सेल है, या इंटरस्टेट है जहां पर दो स्टेट इन्वॉल्व. सो एज पर द अर्लियर लॉज, जो इंट्रा स्टेट सेल पर उस पर्टिकुलर स्टेट का राइट था वैट कलेक्ट करने का, और इंटर स्टेट स्टेट पर सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट का राइट था टैक्स कलेक्ट करने का. सिमिलरली एक्साइज वाज पार्शियल, कुछ आइटम्स पे सिर्फ स्टेट गवर्नमेंट ले रही थी, कुछ आइटम पर सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ले रही थी, और कुछ आइटम्स पर दोनों गवर्नमेंट्स ले रही थी. सो व्हाट जीएसटी हैज डन, दैट they have closed this multi-point window for the consumer. Consumer has to pay only one window tax in the form of GST, and whatever is the classification or the distribution among the government, that will be done once the GST reaches the GST network, and that is why this consumer has to do nothing with that. But what I am why I am discussing this, that some items are still under this purview of the state excise and the state VAT, for example, petroleum products and the tobacco products. And in addition, certain goods and services are not put under. the purview of any tax and they have been exempted. So there can be two kind of things. One kind of items which are not under the purview of the GST and the other which have been specifically exempted. So the items which are not under the purview of the GST are not a part of discussion here, and the others will either be exempted or the taxable. So this turnover includes the value of all taxable supplies. That is the items which are not exempted as per the negative list. But when you calculate the eligibility, though exempted items are not chargeable to GST, but for determining the eligibility for registration, your all exempt supplies will also be included. So if you have made 18 lakhs for taxable supply and 4 lakhs of exempt supply, you will be liable to pay tax only on the 18 lakhs because you have become eligible to registration because of the turnover exceeding 20 lakhs because it is 18 plus 4, that is 24. Similarly, if you are in the concept of any export of the supplies, because normally when you import, then there is custom, and if there is the concept of interstate supply. So before we move forward, in addition to the registration based on the threshold, this interstate supply is also a criteria. So those dealers, those suppliers who make an interstate supply will always be liable for registration irrespective of the amount. And that interstate supplies is also included in calculate the aggregate turnover. Okay? And in addition, all other supplies. So sometimes supplies are made by the agent on behalf of the principal. So the supplies of the agent are deemed as the supply of the principal, so that all turnover of your agent will be deemed to be your turnover and will make you eligible for registration as per the concept of aggregate turnover. So primarily, if your aggregate turnover, which consists of these primary five items, keeping in mind that if the tax is payable under the reverse charge mechanism, then this will not be included in this aggregate turnover. So this will not include the reverse charge mechanism turnover. The value of the reverse charge turnover will not be included in calculating the aggregate turnover. Similarly, when you make a transaction of say 10,000 and you have charged as say tax of 18%, then the value comes out to be 11,800. So this is the value of supply. This is not the value of the supply. So this is the value of supply. I'm again repeating. This is not the value of the supply, and therefore any amount of GST, whether of CGST, SGST, IDGST, whatever, will also be not included in calculating the aggregate turnover. And similarly, if you are doing certain work as a job work, so supply as a job work, it means you are doing the work for someone else. So this supply as job work will also be not included in the aggregate turnover, will also be not included in the aggregate turnover. So keeping all these parameters in mind, we have to calculate the aggregate turnover. And if that aggregate turnover exceeds such threshold limits of 20 lakhs or 10 lakhs or whatever, then you are liable to get yourself registered. And in addition, the other criteria for compulsory registration will always be the interstate supply. That is, whenever you make interstate supply, that is, you are selling goods from one state to another, then irrespective of your turnover value, registration is compulsory. So interstate supply will always make the registration compulsory irrespective of the quantum of turnover. And this has to be noted that the GST registration is a PAN based registration and it is wholly online platform known as the GSTN. and therefore GST number, that is the GSTN, will be a 15-digit code where the first 10 characters will always be your pen, and the next 5 characters out of them, the two will be your state code, and the three will be the goods or the services code, which we use the word HSN code. So in this way, we can have a 15-digit code primarily consisting of PAN. So we always say that for each PAN, a specific GST registration is required. So if a company with a single PAN has multiple branches, but that depends कि अगर ये स्टेट में अलग अलग ब्रांचेस हैं because it has a state code, so we need या we have need to have each registration for each state separately. तो रजिस्ट्रेशन पैन स्पेसिफिक भी है और स्टेट स्पेसिफिक भी है बिकॉज आपके रजिस्ट्रेशन नंबर में स्टेट कोड है. बट अगर आपकी एक ही स्टेट में मल्टीपल ब्रांचेस हैं देन इट इज योर चॉइस कि आप रजिस्ट्रेशन सिंगल करें या मल्टीपल. सो कीपिंग ऑन ऑल दिस प्राइमरी एंड ब्रॉड ऑब्जेक्टिव्स इन broad concepts in mind, we hope that the broad concept registration is clear.